Hello, everyone, and good morning to our webinar this lovely sunny day. I hope you're all well and managed to enjoy the sunshine at the weekend. As I've said, welcome to this webinar that we've got going on. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Natasha Priya-Cannon, and I am the Managing Director here at Investment. So we are joined for this webinar today, and it's in partnership with Access Screening and Employment Screening Software. And as you'll be able to see by the title of the event, it's Screening 101, Avoiding Reputational Damage, Fines and Bad Hires, which is a hugely popular and hot now. We're delighted, as you'll be able to see by the webcam, by Adam Lindsay this morning, and he'll be taking us through some of your challenges and questions, and also some insight that they're in a unique position to view as well. So that will be over the next 30 minutes, and we'll be able to get some questions going throughout as well. So to the right-hand side of your screen, if you have any questions throughout the session, please do feel free to type them in. No one else is able to see those questions, so don't feel as though you're asking a silly one, which sometimes can feel like the case. But I appreciate that Access and some screening questions aren't the norm for everyone. So we are going to get started, and I will let Adam get started just shortly. If anyone has got any questions, do feel free to pop them in. But let me hand over to Adam, and I'll see you guys shortly. Adam, over to you.
Thanks, Natasha. Morning, everybody. As Natasha's mentioned, I'm Adam Lindsay. I've worked within screening for about 12 years now, with Access for coming up to 5. And I work with clients of all shapes and sizes across different industries, helping them to manage their compliance, be it through a managed service or through automation. I'm on the hand there to advise and guide anyone who needs help, really. So we're going to take you through how to avoid reputational damage, fines and bad hires, and give you some good pointers on screening in general as well. And as Natasha's mentioned, any questions we can follow up towards the end, and we can also share this information as a follow-up too. So don't worry about taking too many notes. All the information in the slides will be shared after this session, but do feel free to get involved and ask questions at the end as well. So let's start with what we're going to cover briefly. So we'll have a broad look at what candidate screening is. I would assume from the audience there will be an understanding of that, so don't worry, it won't be war and peace on that side. Why it's important, different ways you can screen as well. Looking at the new age of screening, but the new ways of doing things through automation and keeping things in-house where possible. The things you'd need to look out for, or we would recommend that the organisations are doing, best practice in screening. What things you need to take into account for millennials. Common pitfalls, and there's some key takeaways as well. So without further ado, we'll crack on and go through this. So a bit of an exec summary to start with. Now, with over 3/4 of applications containing inaccurate information, and the CIPD estimate the cost to recruit a skilled worker is over £7,000, although I'd suggest perhaps the costs are slightly higher when you consider the hidden costs of retraining and others as well. It's important that you get it right. So putting tools in place to help you manage screening, to make sure the candidate experience is of an optimal level and you're getting the right people in, is important. If you do things properly, you can avoid issues such as fines, things getting into the press, antisocial behaviour, and increased staff churn. We've got some stats that we'll go through later on, but one key one that we found, that 69% of candidates are more likely to stay for 3 years or more if they go through a well-structured onboarding process. And I think with that comes in a mixture of technology and people, making sure you've got the right systems in place and the right people to help you with your onboarding as well. Research alarmingly says that 75% of companies discriminate against ex-offenders. Of course, the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act, that's something we should avoid, but certainly we would recommend looking at criminal history. And by 2020, millennials will represent half the global workforce. So again, taking into account the change in the market is important on that as well. And then benefits of automation. There is ways now of using software to reduce the manual admin tasks when doing screening or any form of recruitment, to be fair. What you want to try and do, whether it's through automation or just your own processes, is improve your time to hire. Make sure you've got audit trails behind everything and reduce any manual tasks while staying compliant as well. So there's a brief summary there. Let's crack on now. So what is background screening? It's not the Spanish Inquisition to start with. although you are looking to find out as much information as you can about a candidate. For me, what you're trying to achieve is a holistic view of a candidate, so you can just be sure on the one hand they are who they say they are, and on the other they've done what they say they've done. You want to try and quantify a human being, so marry up your experience when you're meeting these people and reviewing their CV, and then quantify their background history, be it through employment history, financial checks, criminal checks, whatever you want to do, so you can put your experience together with technology, so you can make a well-judged decision on getting someone through the door. It isn't just as simple as collecting a couple of references, but that does play a key part of it. You want to make sure that you understand all the roles in your organisation, the level of risk, put things in place so you can do background screening. It should support an effective onboarding journey, and you don't want it to be disjointed for the candidate. So really, it's not just getting checks. It should be part of a seamless journey from a candidate applying for a role and eventually joining your organisation or not. And what you're left with is key information about whether they're going to be a success or not within the organisation. Of course, then you've got to use your own experience in that. So there's a brief introduction on that. It's relevant across every industry. Every single person in employment in the UK will go through some set of compliance, be it a right to work check or employment history. But from the public transport attendant who helped you get to work today, or the solicitor who helped you buy the dream house, or the doctor that's helping our children when they're poorly, or teachers are teaching them now, everyone goes through a certain set of compliance. And it's probably more widespread than people realise. So it's imperative that you take steps to make sure you understand your compliance and what checks you need to put in place as well. So why organisations tend to screen, and there are other reasons as well, but these are the core ones. One, to enhance candidate experience, and also make sure that people come through the doors stay with the organisation as well. Of course, you want to comply with legislation. You might be audited by an outside body, which we'll come on to later, but you need to comply to law. But of course, right to work falls in that as well. You want to protect the organisation, both your processes and practices. You might have sensitive data internally, but also from your staff, from things like antisocial behaviour, harassment, bullying, and just making sure the organisations protect with your reputation, with your process, with your practice, and your employees and stakeholders as well. You want to reduce your time to hire. It's a competitive market out there, and a delayed recruitment process can mean you miss out on the best talent. You want to improve the quality of hire as well, making sure they've got the right skill sets to become an asset to the organisation. And then, of course, at the same time, it's good to protect your reputation. But if you think about the communication lines, when you are talking about background history, you may do a couple of references per candidate. Each communication goes out to a different organisation, so you can be promoting your reputation at the same time with candidates and other businesses by basically showing them you care enough to have an effective onboarding and screening process in place. So they're typical reasons, but there are more available too. So if it does go wrong, we'll start there. It can be a problem. We see regularly press releases and stories hitting the media about things that have gone wrong with background screening. Some high profile cases in the last couple of years. A senior director at a large recruitment agency didn't have their qualifications checked. As a result, they stole a great deal of money for personal gain, spending it on holidays and shopping and shoes and various other things. Now, it's not to say if they'd had the right qualifications, the person wouldn't have done that, but if they checked them out in the first place, that candidate wouldn't have made it through because they didn't have the relevant qualifications to be in that position as a financial director. And again, other things that we look at, delivery drivers who hadn't had their criminal records checked, who were a convicted rapist, turned up on the doorstep of a customer and caused harm to that person. Again, information wasn't checked. Had due diligence been done, this person wouldn't have got through the net, and that wouldn't have caused an issue. So that it's worrying for the customers, but from a client perspective or from a corporate perspective, that getting into the press is a real damage. And again, other things have had where criminal records haven't been done with large transport organisations. We've got right to work issues with Byron Burgers in the past. It only takes one negative thing to get to the press to have a knock-on effect to the organisation, especially with social media. So avoid the problems by getting the process right in the first place. Some things will be unavoidable, but if you're taking enough steps to protect the organisation, you can minimise the chance of anything getting out into the media. So a good way to start is understand how you're regulated. And again, there would be more that's on the screen here, but these are the core ones. 5.8, BPSS, Financial Conduct Authority, and there might be different sets of regulations across one business. You'll have a finance department where there'll be some control positions. You might have people working with children or vulnerable adults. You might have driving license checks that need to be done. Understand what you need to adhere to, make sure you've got the right process in place, and then carry out those checks with an audit trail behind them. Now, as an employer, we've got a responsibility, of course, to our staff, but also to any other stakeholders in there, directors, shareholders, and the general public alike. For me, this is your opportunity to put the process in place to protect all the stakeholders and the business at the same time. And it can be easily overlooked in terms of compliance because you want to get people through the door. But without the relevant checks in place, you could be putting the business at risk. So make sure you understand what you can and can't do, and then put the process in place for that. So some key stats, and you can take these away as to why candidate experience is so important. And for me, it is a massive thing these days. A candidate going through a structured onboarding process, understanding where all the communications come from at every stage is imperative. They want to feel that they're joining the right organisation for their future career. So 38% of candidates are more likely to stay with the business if their experience is positive. 72% sharing the negative experience online. I think that's probably a bit more alarming. 83% of candidates change their mind about a role when they've gone through a negative experience. Again, pretty worrying. And those who have a positive experience are 54% greater productivity rates. So again, getting it right can really help. And as I've mentioned as well, with a well-structured onboarding process, you can improve, potentially increase their tenure in the organisation. So minimising costs for retraining and rehiring there. But over 60% of employees have read one piece of negative feedback to their application process. So there's obviously things that people can improve. Every organisation is different. If there's ways you can improve that, perhaps you can look at automation or working with a partner. That's your choice, and we can talk through options as we go along with this. So where do we go from here? If you are going to screen, you've got a few options. You can keep things in-house, so do it all of yourself. Now, the benefits of that, you will have control over the process, but do you have the right training throughout the business to understand and assimilate information? Can you easily link into third-party checks to get your criminal records, your driving licenses, your credit checks? Is there one central system that you can use to report from and have audit trails behind there? If not, it can be a time-consuming process. It's difficult to manage and policies don't get updated and you can leave yourself at risk. If, however, you've got all those things in place, you can do things manually. It's a good way of doing it, but there are ways of improving the process using a little bit of technology to mean you can have an in-house approach as well. The other option is to fully outsource it with a managed service provider, and many of them use our software as well, but you have the ability to use our software from a corporate perspective too. If you are outsourcing, it can be expensive. It can be a disjointed process for the candidate, which some of you will have experienced, where they're joining your organisation, then they're called by an external agency, and perhaps they've gone through a really severe process that's given them a negative experience. If you are going to work with a partner, you want to make sure they understand your policy, your goals, and implement that into the screening process as well. Often we've found with large organizations I've worked with, they've lacked a bit of control, a little bit of visibility on things like reporting, and in many managed service environments, and not all, you're left with a lot of incomplete files where those in the call centre for the managed service are hitting their KPI of making 3 attempts to contact a referee, but then returning that back as a completed result for you, which obviously isn't completed, but they've hit their KPI. So, and it's not to discredit an outsourced managed service approach, because there's some great ones out there, and we work with some as well. But if you are, just make sure it's a partner, not just a provider, that's going to support the way you want to work, and make sure your candidates have the best experience and that you get the results that you need as well. Other options now with automation, so you can use software. What this allows you to do is have the same kind of tools as a managed service provider, so a system to help you do the background checks, to take away the admin burden, but allowing you to put your stamp on it. So it's almost a hybrid of using your in-house experience with software to link up to all the vetting requirements you need, and then put your own process, style, wording, and all the workflows you need to make sure you're going through the process that you desire. So good options there. It just depends on how your organization works. If you've got an in-house team, certainly using software can work. If you want to fully outsource, just make sure you get the decision right. Okay, so with automation, I'll tell you a little bit about it before we go into more granular detail on screening. What we've found and what our clients have found, Through using software like ours, you can have a really improved candidate experience, having a branded candidate portal with your logos, your wording, your look and feel in there, which helps the candidate, but also helps promote that you're a forward-thinking organisation. Having the ability to pull off reports at every stage, perhaps about background check detail or status or SLA performance, gives you the ability to improve your process moving forward. Also gives you the ability to provide audit trails for those who need to see it. So really, really useful and helpful. Audit trails that are automatically collected with a date and timestamp of when things were collected and every action recorded are important if you're audited by people like Ofsted or CQC, so you can see where the information was done, how it was collected, who gave the information, so on and so forth. If you're using an automated approach, you're not paying for the privilege of having an outsourced service, you're using your own internal resource to run a platform. So that should result in lower cost per check and more consistency across the business. The configuration elements mean you can have every role accounted for in a workflow and put things in place across the organisation. Never miss any expiring documents. Maybe you want to do a recheck of DBS every 3 years. You could do a bulk upload and fire out many thousands of invites in one go. But you can record things like visa expiries, driving license expiries, and be alerted as to when they need to be rechecked. So putting in place the rules you need to make sure you don't miss any compliance. And then you've got things now these days with right to work mobile apps, which allow you to adhere to the Home Office list and create a statutory legal defence without being an expert in right to work. So a really good option to control centrally and let those out on site collect the information in the presence of a candidate as well. And of course, with any software nowadays, or with any modern day software, you'll be cloud-based where you can access from any time and anywhere. So what we recommend you look for, a good starting point is identity, and that does go hand in hand with the right to work, but they are separate in their ways. You can do things like electoral roll searches, you can collect their relevant documentation, utility bills, so on and so forth, and make sure they're genuine and valid. So you want to cross-reference that you've met the candidate and their documentation matches who they are, perhaps do an electoral roll search on that as well. So that's the first step. Ensure the candidate is who they say they are. And then as we move through, we want to be sure they've done what they say they've done as well. So right to work. So at the same time as right to work, you can do an identity check. Right to work is probably one of the most overlooked, most severe areas of background screening. The consequences of failure are pretty severe, fines up to £20,000, potential prison sentences, and disqualification from public procurement arenas as well. So make sure you're following the Home Office list. Make sure you're collecting the documents in the presence of the candidate and you've got an audit trail behind that. Make sure all the questions are being asked, expiry dates are being confirmed, and you've got an audit trail behind that. This can be done electronically or manually. By doing it electronically, you take away that step whereby you're taking the documents from a candidate, photocopying them, stamping it, putting it away. It does it all for you. So you can do it whilst they're there during an interview process. And again, putting the candidate at ease without having to leave them alone for a little bit. So really simple and straightforward. Get that done. We can talk about the right to work in more detail if needs be in the Q&A. So then a good option, and you don't have to do these, but it's a good way of understanding integrity and honesty, is to look at criminal checks and further data checks as well. So of course you can do enhanced disclosures for those working with children or vulnerable adults, or a standard for those who work in regulated environments. But some people overlook the fact you can do a basic disclosure on absolutely everybody, which is now all under the DBS, can all be done electronically. So you can do a basic with no restrictions on every potential employee. And if you're asking a question, for instance, have you had a criminal conviction in the past? And the answer is no, and it comes back that they've had one, then it's a good indication of honesty and integrity. On the same token, if someone's honest about their criminal history, you shouldn't discriminate against them as a potential employer unless that offence was something directly regulated or directly related to the role they're doing, and then it's a question to be asked. You can go a lot further than this as well. You can look at things like credit inquiries, driving licence checks, social media if needs be, counter-terrorism. There are pretty much checks you can look at for every compliance set and every industry. Just understand the level of risk, make sure they're relevant to the role and put them in place, and make sure you're adhering to T's and C's and employment contracts as well, which we'll cover shortly. As you go through, it is against the law for any hirer to refuse to employ someone because of a spent conviction, and 20% of employers ask in potentially unlawful ways. So there's no point asking this information if it's not in the right way or the right format. There's no point asking questions about criminal records if you're not actually doing the check as well. So 5% of annual revenue is lost to occupational fraud, and over 600 billion annually is spent as a result of a cost to employers as a result of fraud. So it's pretty damning stats. If you're putting these checks in place, you can help minimize the level of risk to the organization, be it fraud, be it harassment, be it bullying, be it your customers. Put checks in place to make sure that you're protecting everybody in the stage. So if you do find a criminal record when you're screening candidates, you need to take a few steps. You need to evaluate and assess the type of crime, the severity, when it happened, and if it relates to the role. Make sure that you're on the right side of the law, so be aware of any bias factors. And it is, as I've mentioned, it's against the law to refuse based on a spent conviction under the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act. People do have convictions. People make mistakes. We do silly things when we're younger. We have driving offences. So don't just discount talent just because they've had a criminal history. Of course, there's certain industries where it will prohibit that. But in general, if you are doing basic disclosures and other checks as well, make sure you're being realistic and fair to the candidate based on the legislation that's in place. Some criminal checks can take quite a long time. So make sure that candidates are aware of lead times and potentially your internal team are as well. But also make sure you're asking early on in the process, perhaps in an applicant tracking system, have you had any unspent convictions? And make sure you can flag that and then cross-reference it with a check as well. If you are going to use software, you can help remove the bias as well. Ultimately, a criminal record is a criminal record. You'll get the information from a candidate. You'll do these checks, but it's not down to a human opinion, an opinion from a human. It's down to what has been on their background history and what's come back, and then you can make a decision to hire from there as well. So qualification checks, alarmingly, this is probably the biggest area of fraud within screening, not to scaremonger, but I'm sure we've all seen some fairly creative CVs in our time. Over 40% of applicants falsify academic qualifications. It's quite easy to change that 2.2 to a 2.1. I think it'll never get checked. On the same token, if you are doing qualifications, make sure it's relevant. There's no point checking something if it's not relevant to the role. But certainly you can take steps to look at certificates to make sure they're genuine and not fraudulent. You can purchase certificates online from a well-known auction site now whilst getting nectar points. So it's very easy to do. But with 11% making up entire degree qualifications and 33% of graduates stating inaccurate information on a CV, it's good to cross-reference what they provide on an application form, what's on the CV, what qualifications they've got, and make sure they're accurate and not fraudulent. But again, make sure it's role relevant. I've got a degree in geography and I've worked in background screening, so not necessarily relevant to my role, but it was still checked to make sure I was honest about my background history. So just decide what you want to do, put things in place. We're not here to dictate process to organisations, but the options are there for you to do further checks on things like qualifications as well. Employment history, it's changed over the years. Gone are the days where you get huge amounts of information about how they've performed and what they've done. It has pretty much become a tick box exercise where you get dates of employment, reason for leaving, maybe would you rehire, possibly salary, but even that's rare these days. There will be some smaller organisations who will happily commit opinion, but typically organisations, well, anything from 100 employees up or even smaller, will give granular information, which will come from HR. So it can be a very time-consuming process to be phoning up these referees just to get that information. So if you can put a process in place that contacts them and chase them automatically, it can really help you. It needs to be easy for the candidate to provide their information, easy for the referee to provide that too. I'm sure many of you would have had to give employment references. It's probably never top of the list when you've got a day-to-day job to do as well. So if it's simple for the referee to fill out and they can fill things out online, perhaps with the consent from the candidate included, it'll make it very easy. And then if you don't want to put resource to those chasing it, you can have a system behind them that chases referees and candidates via email to get their information so you can act on it accordingly. Then if we're looking at best practice in screening, there's some key things to understand. For me, understand what the roles you have in your organisation are, from entry levels through to director level. Put the level of risk from there and then assign the right checks from that too. So just take some understand the structure of the business, the roles you've got, the checks in place, and put that across. Make sure internally that the responsibility for screening is designated to someone. For those for training staff, for those making the decision to hire, for those updating any policies, give it clear structure across the organisation. Know who's carrying out checks, who's making decision to hire, who's putting the process in place for workflows and all the roles you've got, and make sure they're accountable as well. With your policy, make it organisation wide, give it structure, understand what the consequence of failure is as well, and what a red flag means to you, and make sure you're documenting that in your T's and C's and contracts. There's no point doing background checks if you can't take action retrospectively on them as well. Have a think about if you're in a global environment, do you need a policy to get information from the candidate's country of origin? Have you been clear with the candidates about what they need to go through at the early stage? Have you been clear with your internal team about how things work and the process they go through? Just document it, put it in place, and work to a set structure that you put in place. If you are using third-party data checks, you will need to link into some form of third party. Now, how you do that is entirely up to you. You could have disparate systems going into different suppliers, or on the same token, you could have one central place where it all goes. Understand what you need to do and make sure you've got the process in place to get those checks done. And then you can easily create a candidate file and report with all their information in it. So candidate reports are key, so they can be added to their HR file about their employment history and whatever other checks you've done. But also you want to report on how the screening process has gone ahead and what you can do to improve the process, where candidates are dropping out. Are you meeting SLAs? Is there anything else that you need to adhere to and look at to improve your process? Without the data, you can't do anything about it. If you've got the data, you can look at what you need to improve and take steps to reduce your time to hire and the whole process throughout that as well. So an automated screening process looks a bit like this. So a candidate will apply for a role, perhaps through your applicant tracking system. They get through the filter and then they get invited for an interview. At interview stage, you could be opening up a right to work app, going through right to work in line with the Home Office list and collecting any other important documents for ID or DBS or whatever it might be in that app. From there, the app would sync the information into a main system. So if the candidate is successful and they're offered the role, then they would start the background checks. So you would click a button, start a background check, which would send a link to the candidate for them to provide their information in a secure candidate portal that's branded with the client logos. The candidate gives consent for the checks to be done and the data to be used. Background check automatically, so it would fire off information to the relevant third-party checks. Your internal team monitors the progress of the background checks and looks for any red flags, which will be highlighted automatically in the system. And then decisions to hire can be made from the information there and the experience of meeting the candidate, and you're left with a nice little neat report on each candidate about where they've been, what they've done, and then you can move them forward into the process. So that's, although it's an automated screening process, fits in really with, in general, if you're using manual processes too, you just replace the right to work out with the manual stage and manual processes in the screening as well. But automation works really, really well. So when we're talking about millennials, it's important that you have an improved digital experience. So, people are tech savvy these days, not just millennials, but a candidate experience that they can do on their mobile phone or tablet. We are seeing over 70% of candidates are going through this process. We often find that people have smart devices, but not necessarily laptops these days. So having a mobile friendly or a mobile optimized candidate portal goes a long way to improving a millennials experience, but also candidates in general. When looking at things like social media, again, for me, the check's an important check, but make sure it's relevant for the role. For an entry-level position, perhaps it's not. Perhaps it's a little bit too intense. But you want to be making sure that certainly for a senior position, there's been no negative posts online to do with homophobia, racism, whatever it might be. But again, it's not really about their social life. It's about things that could affect your business. So if you are going to do things like social media, get the balance right. For those who have recently left education, they might not have much work history, or little or no credit footprint as well. So you need to understand what information you can get. You might need to get character references. You might need to get an academic reference to match that up. but get any core information. They'll certainly have ID information there. They may not have a driving license. They might not have much of a credit history, but you can still assimilate information to make sure the candidate is the right person and they've done what they say they've done. And then you can judge them on a case-by-case basis. Certainly be looking at things like qualification checks from there if there's no employment history as well. I mean, how do you make them feel? I don't think this is just restricted to millennials. I think this everyone should be treated in the same way with the same level of respect, whatever age they are, throughout the screening process. But we want to make sure you get the right level of customer service. You know, starting the candidate experience off in a positive way can really benefit the organisation in the long run. The person who's joining the organisation feels at peace that they've made the right decision, and they go through a structured process. When they join, they're ready to go. They know what information they need. They know when they're starting. They've had all their contracts. They've had all their background checks done. And at every stage, they've been updated as to what they're doing. So be transparent, be honest throughout the process. Make sure they understand that they're going through certain checks and give feedback. Because they may not be right for your role, but the feedback might help them improve moving forward as well. And again, time is of the essence. Time to hire is important across all organisations. It is a competitive market out there. So if you're going through a slow, clunky application process and your competitor's going through a really slick process, they've applied for both jobs, I think it's fair to say, you know, which one the candidate might end up at because they get placed quicker. So make sure you've got the best possible process for the candidate to join your organisation, and make sure your time to hire is at the lowest level it can be. So looking at best practices, avoiding common pitfalls that in-house recruiters make. So it's really important to understand the regulations across the business. Of course, you may have a broad compliance set you need to adhere to, but within the same organisation, you probably will have more than one set of compliance you need to adhere to. So understand that from the roles that you've got and put the checks in place. Make sure that candidates are engaged and the application process is as smooth as it can be, and the time to hire is at the minimum level as well. You don't want to be losing candidates because you've not taken the time to make sure the process is at the right standard. It's a really good opportunity to promote your brand through screening, making sure all the communication goes to potential candidates, to referees, and it's got your look and feel on there as well. Putting your organisation in the right position to be a forward-thinking business and getting candidates through a nice process can be really valuable. And then from this here as well, you can look at our 10-step screening evaluation process and other things that we've got as well there. But really, you just need to make sure you've got the right technology, the right people, the right ability to report. Make sure you've got audit trails, make sure your policies are updated, and put things in place across the business to help you. Any of these white papers we can share with our resource page as well. So these will be shared afterwards, but there's some links to resources that we provide, some white papers, pre-employment screening survival kits. We do lots of events with in-house recruitment and also the Home Office as well. But feel free, once you get this information, to have a look at anything we've got. There's lots of webinars on there, white papers that will help you improve your process. So further events that we're looking at as well. So for the Home Office, right to work webinars, DBS webinars as well. So we can provide them, either contact us or speak to the in-house recruitment network too. And that's pretty much me in terms of the webinar. So now feel free to ask any questions that you need to, and we'll go from there.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Adam. That was really insightful, as always. And we do have a couple of questions. So if you do have any additional ones as you're going through to all of our attendees, please do feel free to pop them on the right-hand side, and we'll try to get through as many of them as possible. So the first question that we'll start off with is more and more employers are doing back channeling via networking as part of the candidate screening process, which is not often part of the formal hiring strategy, and applicants aren't always aware that this has been going on. Do you think this is a fair way of screening, and can it be avoided?
In terms of networking, how do you mean on that?
The back channeling and candidate screening process. So it's not formal, it's just sort of happening behind the scenes, so people aren't necessarily aware that they're having that sort of screening process.
Yeah, no, it's for me, there's one thing that's absolutely imperative with background screening, and that's consent of the candidate. If there's things going on that they're not aware of, it's putting your organisation at risk. So whilst you might think it's a clever way of information from the candidate without them knowing, actually what you're doing is potentially having a negative experience, having access to data that you might not have consent to get done. For me, it's all about consistency, transparency with the candidate. Look, if they've done things that are wrong, it should come out in a background check anyway. There's no need to be underhanded about how that information, or not underhanded. There's no need to get that information through back channeling. Put things in place, get the consent, make sure the candidate's aware of that, and then act on the information that comes back.
Okay, great. Hopefully that answered your question there, Edward. So another one is, we're an IT software business. Our DPO has told us that under new GDPR legislation, we should no longer be asking our new starters to complete a basic CRC. Is this correct?
I'd have to look at the policy directly for that, but there should be no restrictions for to be able to do a basic criminal disclosure if you want to do that. There is no reason why you can't be doing that. Sometimes it's a cost issue that people don't want to spend that money, but as long as you're asking and getting the consent of the candidate, you can do a basic criminal disclosure on anybody without any restrictions. Certainly with a lot of IT consultancies I've worked with, they might go in and have access to sensitive information or need BPS screening standard for any government contracts, things like that. So it's fairly common that would happen. You're certainly not restricted. You would be restricted to do enhanced if they're not working with children or vulnerable adults, or standard if they're not in a regulated environment. But basics, no, there should be no restrictions on that at all.
Well, I think the key thing is that you have to get the consent. So as long as you're getting the consent, then there's no restrictions. Yeah,
absolutely. But also if you are doing a basic disclosure, a good thing is to ask in your application process, have you had any convictions in the last 5 years? And then the answer yes or no, and then you are doing criminal check, that gives you a good sign of honesty and integrity. But no, it's not a compliance issue as to why you would stop doing a disclosure. I suspect it might be an issue of cost, perhaps. But for me, most organisations we work now will be doing basic disclosures on pretty much everyone they hire, just to make sure they've got the right level of honesty and integrity to join the business.
Okay, great. So the next question, hopefully that answered your question there, Emma. How do you stop bias or prove that you're not biased when you're doing the screening process? Yeah,
it's a difficult thing to say because people are people, and you can hide things at the end of the day, can't you? But you're marrying up your experience as a HR or recruitment person with technology. So if you're quantifying the candidate's history, granular data for where they've worked, or credit information or ID information or criminal information, there can be no bias because that's just granular information about that candidate. So even if someone didn't like that particular person, that suggests they probably wouldn't get through to the background screening stage, and that would happen. But when you're using background checks, you're removing bias completely because you're just quantifying, not that that's entirely possible, quantifying a human being. So you're saying where they've been, what they've done, and accurate information about their address, their criminal history, their financial history, their work history. That's all information that can be shared, and that's all information that doesn't need to change. So there's no bias required with that. If any bias does occur, there might be personal opinion in terms of interview stage. But I suspect most people in the HR and recruitment arena are pretty open to candidates, because that's how we work and what we do. So I think as long as you're marrying up the right checks, either through technology or through outsourcing, with your experience, you can remove bias where possible.
Brilliant. And just a bit more of a general question. What trends are you currently seeing with screening at the moment? Is there anything that's sort of coming out a little bit more so? Is it technology? What's going on in the world of screening?
I think we've seen a big change in industry. The larger managed service providers out there, there's an element of distrust to some of them. So we're seeing a shift of people working with their recruitment agencies, their RPOs, or trying to keep things in-house and looking at different ways of screening. And again, it's not to say that there are managed service providers who do a great job, but we've certainly seen a more niche or a more tailored approach to screening, where organizations, they don't just want an out-of-the-box product. They want everything in their organization to be understood and adhered to. So they want to configure the hierarchy of the business, the look, the feel, the wording, the background checks that need to be done. So for me, it's just, there's been a switch that people want to control costs, but they still want to have the optimal level of compliance. So I've seen more influx of people want to bring things in-house and using software, but also those who are using outsourced services, that they're looking for new partners who can offer them a bit more, perhaps do their recruitment as well as their vetting, or they go to a more niche outsourced provider who will listen to exactly what they want and put those rules in place. I think some of the larger ones have left some clients out there feeling a little unloved and not getting the information that they need. So yeah, certainly shifts in trends. We're all a bit more tech savvy. There's lots of ways of using bots and AI and automation through screening and other products as well. So there's definitely a switch to an increased level of technology, mobile based as well, and app usage where possible, and then just a real focus on actually getting what they want from their screening, making sure that the candidates have had the right checks done and that they are going to join the business and be an asset. So less it being just a tick box, now it's part of a candidate journey and a candidate experience as well.
Okay, great. And I think the final question to come through is, how does the Right to Work mobile app that you were mentioning earlier, how does that work, and can it be used as proof of compliance?
Yes, it can, as long as it's been managed from your team. So Right to Work is the process where you check, you obtain, you check, and you audit the information from the Home Office. So the app works in its very simplest form. It's built so that anyone who's not an expert user can go through Right to Work from the Home Office list. So a candidate will come in for interview. The hiring manager will open up the app. They will enter the candidate's basic details. They can be pre-populated and controlled centrally as well, but from this perspective, we'll tell you how it works. So they put the candidate details in, choose nationality. Once nationality is chosen, it will then provide a drop-down list of the documentation that's acceptable from that country of origin, and take the hiring manager down the route of what they need to collect. It will then ask them to collect the information in terms of a photo of that documentation, so it's taking away the old stamp, the old photocopying and stamping. It will then give an audit trail of who's done that check, frame all the information for you so it's in one central space. It will then ask the questions for Right to Work, which are read out to the candidate, and you give yes, no answers. Then finally, it will take a picture of the candidate, or the hiring manager will take a picture. So the front end, you've got a unique identifier, someone logging in from the corporate end. Back end, picture of the candidate to prove you're with them at that point in time. And in between that, the documentation and questions to adhere to Right to Work. And then you get an immediate pass or fail. And you can also embed an MRZ check in there. So you can read the algorithm on the passport to make sure it's not fraudulent. And if needs be, you can then collect other forms of ID and documentation in there. So if you follow those steps and then you sense check that to make sure the information is correct with the central platform, which you can do in HR and recruitment, then yes, it will give you a statutory legal defense on that. You can't outsource a Right to Work check. It is always your responsibility to accept or reject that and make sure you're doing it in the candidate's presence, but you can use systems to make sure that you've got a seamless process. And then if needs be, you can support your ID by collecting other forms of documentation with you as well.
Okay, excellent. We have had another question come through, and it's a really, actually we've had a couple come through. So one is there any formal training sessions for those that are perhaps new to the recruitment sort of profession themselves? Is there any formal training or workshops out there at all?
We run a series of webinars that help. We've got lots of papers that can assist. In terms of formal training, I can't think of many outside bodies that would come in and train you on screening, but certainly we can provide information to help with that. Providers should be able to give advice on that as well. But in terms of any outside bodies, I'm not sure, but we've certainly got resource links that can help you get where you need to be. Or if you want to chat with any of us, we'll gladly arrange a meeting.
Yeah. And that would be for HR or hiring managers, as well as in-house recruitment professionals as well, I assume.
Yeah, I mean, HR, yeah, exactly. It all sort of falls under the same bracket. But for any of those who need assistance with how to screen and what to do, whether or not you use our systems or not, we'd be on hand to help with that. And I'd certainly guide you to the resource page that we've got. Some of the white papers are really, really useful. The 10-step checklist is full of really core information as well. But I think sometimes just little groups like this, and talking to people who work within the same area and the same peers are really helpful. The events that we've done in the past, Natasha, people share information and learn things from that as well. So whilst there might not be necessarily any formal ones, although I'm sure if you really Google it, you could find somebody to train you. But I'd suspect most of them would probably want you to use their system, perhaps. but things like this are very helpful, and we'll share any information we can have as well.
Excellent. And with going back to the app as well, we've had a further question on that. When using the app, do you think it would be better for HR/recruitment or the hiring managers to do the checks through the app? Where would it typically sit, or is that company dependent?
It's company dependent, but for me, I always recommend that centrally HR and recruitment are controlling it, right? And it's no disrespect to anyone outside of HR and recruitment. I think within there, you'll have people who understand what they need to be doing and the consequences of failure. So I would control it centrally with the system, and I would push out invites to those on site to be collecting the information using the app. Once it's collected from there, it will then sync back to the main central system for HR and recruitment to check off to make sure it's all been taken correctly. So it's about the empowerment of understanding those doing the checks know why they're doing it and what they're doing. But whether you control it centrally, you can, if there are any problems or any mistakes made, you can see who's done it and when, and then retrain them and empower them on that. It might be, depending on the size of the organization, it could be very difficult for HR and recruitment to be doing all the right to work checks, because you might have many hundreds of sites where it's just not logistically possible for you to do that. So I think it's understanding the nature of the business, but I would always have HR recruitment with a hint of legal in there, controlling the process, putting the process in place and making sure people are following that process as well. But I would also give the trust to those out on site to collect the information, because more often than not, they'll probably be doing that anyway on their first day or at interview stage in a manual way. So it's a mixture of really understanding what you need best. But yes, the importance of HR and recruitment is undoubted.
Okay, brilliant. I think that is all the questions that we have, and potentially all that we have time for today. So for Adam and Access Screening, thank you very much for hosting this webinar, and I hope it's been useful to all of our attendees. We'll be following up the recorded version of this video with the audio as well. So we'll be sharing that with you post-event. I think it's actually an automated system, so you'll get it literally 2 minutes afterwards. But we'll also follow up afterwards as well. Perhaps give you a link to the resources pages that Adam mentioned a couple of times, and hopefully that will give you a bit more insight as well. But that is all we have time for today, and I hope it's been useful, and I hope to see you at the next one. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.